6 weeks. That's how long Nora Vance had been working the trauma unit at Naval Medical Center before she understood that something was wrong, and it wasn't the patients. It was the people in scrubs standing next to her. Every time she walked into that break room, the noise dropped just a little too fast. The laughter cut off half a second too late. Eyes slid away from her like she was something to be managed rather than someone to be welcomed. She told herself it was nothing. New job nerves. Every rookie feels like an outsider at first, right? But deep down, in that place where instinct lives before logic catches up, she knew something was building. She just never imagined it would explode over the body of a dying man who couldn't even hear the room falling apart around him. Nora hadn't always worked trauma. She'd come from a small community hospital in Ohio, the kind of place where nurses still had time to hold a patient's hand and ask how they were really doing. That world hadn't prepared her for this one. Naval Medical Center didn't run on compassion. It ran on speed. Patients weren't people here. They were cases. Charts weren't stories. They were numbers to clear before the next disaster rolled through the doors. And new nurses, especially ones who still smiled at patients like they mattered, weren't just new. They were targets. At the center of it all stood Britt Holloway, a 12-year charge nurse with a laugh like a door slamming shut and a gift, if you could call it that, for finding exactly where a rookie was soft. Britt had clocked Nora in her very first week. Too gentle, too eager, too soft for a floor that chewed people up before lunch. And Britt Holloway didn't just notice weakness, she used it. On a gray Tuesday afternoon in March, she got her chance. "We've got an incoming," Britt said, sliding a chart across the nurse's station, her smirk already halfway to a laugh. "Deaf patient. No ASL, no lip reading he's comfortable with. Communication's going to be a nightmare." She looked up, eyes gleaming. "I want you on him." Nora's stomach dropped, but she kept her face steady. "Why me?" "Because you're the compassionate one," Britt said, and somehow she made the word sound like an insult. Behind her, 2 nurses pressed their lips together, already fighting back laughter. "You'll figure it out, or you won't. Either way, it should be interesting." What Nora didn't know, what nobody bothered to tell her, was that this wasn't bad luck. It was a setup. Britt had pulled strings through a friend in intake to make sure this exact patient landed in Nora's hands, because whispers had already spread about who he really was. A hardened combat veteran. Deaf. Almost certainly furious and impossible to reach. The perfect stage for a green nurse to fall apart in front of an audience and give the whole floor something to laugh about for months. Nora didn't know any of that. All she knew was that she had 15 minutes and a patient she might not be able to reach at all. She didn't waste a second of it. She sprinted to the supply closet and found a laminated card of basic medical hand signals, the kind nobody ever expected to actually use. She grabbed a whiteboard and a marker off the supply cart. She read through his sparse intake notes twice, memorizing every scrap of information she could find. And she repeated the same words to herself that had carried her through every hard shift since nursing school. Fear is just information, and information can be managed. Then the doors slammed open, and every ounce of preparation nearly wasn't enough. This wasn't the quiet transfer she'd braced for. 2 coursemen came barreling through at a dead run, shouting vitals over each other, wheeling a gurney with a man who was already fighting to sit up despite a shoulder wound soaked black with blood. He looked around 50, silver-haired, built like a man who'd spent 30 years proving younger men wrong about what he could still do. His dress whites were shredded and stained red, and on his collar, even through the blood, 2 silver stars caught the light. A rear admiral. Nobody had warned her about that either. The trauma bay exploded into chaos, monitors screaming, voices shouting orders, someone calling frantically for a surgeon, and in the middle of it, the admiral, dizzy from blood loss and unable to hear a single word swirling around him, was reading pure panic on every face he could see and reacting the only way 3 decades of combat training had taught him to, with force. He grabbed at an IV line. He tried to throw his legs off the gurney. A corpsman half his age wrestled to hold him down, and every second made it worse, because from where the admiral sat, silent and spinning, all he understood was that strangers kept grabbing him, and nobody was explaining why. Britt stood at the edge of the bay, arms folded, waiting to enjoy the show. Nora stepped in front of him instead. She didn't shout. She didn't grab. She lifted both hands, palms open, and held them there, slow and deliberate, until his wild, terrified eyes locked onto hers. Then she raised 2 fingers to her own eyes, then pointed them at him. "Watch me." She'd learned that sign 1 hour ago, off a laminated card nobody had thought she'd ever need. For 1 frozen second, the admiral stopped fighting the corpsman, just long enough to look at her. She snatched the whiteboard and wrote in fast, heavy letters, "You are safe. Naval Hospital. We are helping you." His breathing was still ragged, his hands still trembling, but something in his face cracked open where the panic had been sealing him shut. He looked at her name badge. He looked back into her eyes, and for the first time since those doors had burst open, the room stopped being his enemy. Britt's smirk vanished. The nurses behind her stopped laughing, because whatever they'd expected to happen in that trauma bay, a flustered rookie falling apart, a botched handoff, a story to laugh about for weeks, this wasn't it. This was a bleeding, terrified admiral going quiet and still because a 6-week nurse had looked him dead in the eyes and simply refused to let him drown in silence. Nobody in that room understood yet who this man really was, or what he'd survived to end up on that gurney, or what it would mean for Nora that she was the one who reached him first. But Britt, frozen at the edge of the bay, already had the sinking feeling that her little joke had just gone somewhere she never intended. Before we go further, if this story is pulling you in, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because Aftermath Tales brings you a brand new story like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what happens next. His name, the chart later revealed, was Rear Admiral Thomas Bryant, and the silence that had taken his hearing hadn't come from age. It had come from an IED blast 11 months earlier, off the coast of a country the official report still refused to name. That explosion had taken 2 men from his command and left him with a 15% hearing threshold in one ear and absolute silence in the other. He'd gone back to active duty anyway, because that was the only thing he knew how to be. And today, a training exercise gone wrong had put him on that gurney, wounded and overwhelmed by a wall of noise he couldn't parse, close to fighting off the very people trying to save his life. Nora didn't know any of this yet. All she knew was that the admiral had stopped fighting, and she wasn't about to stop working. She stayed by his side for the next 4 hours straight, turning down every offer of relief. When the surgeon needed consent for emergency shoulder surgery, it was Nora who wrote it out in plain, careful language on the whiteboard, checking his understanding line by line, watching his eyes instead of the clock. When post-op confusion hit and he woke in recovery with his hands searching blindly for threats that weren't there, it was Nora's face he found first, and Nora's whiteboard waiting with the words, "You are safe. Tom, you made it." Someone had told her his first name by then. She used it on purpose. By the second night, something had settled between them that the rest of the floor could see even if they couldn't quite explain it. Still weak, still wired to monitors, the admiral had started reaching for the whiteboard before anyone else even entered the room, as if he had already decided, in a world full of noise he couldn't hear, exactly whose hands he trusted. Britt noticed. Everyone noticed. And on the 3rd day, everyone found out exactly who they had been dealing with. A black SUV convoy rolled up outside the hospital, and 4 uniformed officers stepped out, led by a 3-star vice admiral who strode through the doors demanding to see Rear Admiral Bryant immediately, and demanding just as urgently to know the name of the nurse who had kept him stable through the worst 48 hours of his recovery. Britt was standing at the nurse's station when the question landed. Her mouth opened, some reflexive instinct toward damage control kicking in, some half-formed idea of grabbing credit or dodging blame. And then Bryant, propped up in a wheelchair, being pushed toward the meeting, raised his good hand and pointed directly at Nora. "Her," he said, his voice still rough from disuse, each word shaped with the careful effort of a man relearning how loud his own voice needed to be. "Everyone else in this building saw a broken old man having a bad day. She saw a person. She's the only reason I didn't put someone in the hospital myself." The Vice Admiral turned to Nora, his expression somewhere between disbelief and pure respect. "Nurse Vance, is it? Admiral Bryant runs medical evacuation training for 3 SEAL commands. He's the reason half our special operations corpsmen know how to keep a man alive on a beach with no supplies and no backup coming. And you're telling me a rookie nurse reached him when an entire trauma team couldn't?" "I read a laminated card," Nora said quietly, because taking more credit than that felt dishonest. "You read it," Bryant said, "and you used it. Most people in that room saw a deaf man and thought the problem was his ears. You understood the real problem was fear, and fear doesn't need ears to hear you. That's not something you learn off a card. That's something you already had inside you." 3 days later, it was Britt who finally cracked, cornering Nora in the supply closet. Not exactly to apologize, but to admit, haltingly, that the whole assignment had been a setup from the very beginning, designed purely to embarrass her in front of an audience. Nora listened, felt the old sting rise up in her chest, and then let it go. Because whatever Britt had intended, it hadn't landed the way she planned, and holding on to that cruelty now felt smaller than the person Nora wanted to become. Admiral Bryant made sure the story didn't stay buried on one hospital floor. Before his discharge, he personally recommended Nora Vance for a commendation in patient communication and crisis de-escalation, the kind of honor usually reserved for staff with decades of service behind them. Months later, at a change of command ceremony, he told the story again, without naming names on the record. But everyone in that trauma bay that day knew exactly who he meant when he described a young nurse who chose to see a person before she ever saw a diagnosis. Nora never became the nurse Britt tried to turn into a punchline. She became something else entirely, the one new hires were quietly told to watch and learn from. The one who proved that the loudest voice in a chaotic room is never the strongest one. It's the steadiest pair of hands. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, in a training command full of future corpsmen, a rear admiral who once couldn't hear a single word of the chaos around him made absolutely sure that every soldier he trained learned her name and learned the lesson that came with it. Real courage in medicine was never about fixing what's broken. It's about refusing to let another human being drown in silence when you have the power to reach them. If this story moved you even a little, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay close because on Aftermath Tales, every single episode proves the same thing. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the underestimated ones, they are usually the ones who end up changing everything. We'll see you in the next story.